What's up, everyone? I'm Jackie.
And I'm Lindsay.
And we are Women Leaders in Sports Medicine.
Here to help you grow your game and own your game.
Today we had the honor of speaking with Dr. Chelsi Day, a sports psychologist with Ohio State. We talk about her journey into working in collegiate sports, the benefit of working in private practice prior to working with athletes, building a therapeutic alliance, and more. There are so many good pieces of advice in this conversation that relates to every single sports medicine field. So please be sure to listen until the end for helpful advice on your career. For more information about us, please go to www.womenleadersinsportsmedicine.com. As always, thank you for joining, and we hope you enjoy listening in.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much today for joining us. We have another episode of Women Leaders in Sports Medicine podcast. We're joined today by Ohio State sports psychologist and our first sports psychologist on our podcast, which is awesome, Dr. Chelsi Day. So Chelsi, before we get into your extremely impressive journey, I mean, from all the experiences you've had, the publications you've done, to creating your own psyching team, what has this time off been like for you? Are you currently working?
Yeah. So we are business as usual. It's mostly just time in my house, a lot of time in my house. Our caseloads are a little bit smaller in terms of one-on-one meetings, but we make up for that with other meetings and some initiatives that we're trying to do to kind of stay business as usual, which has been interesting.
I can imagine. Definitely different than going into the school every day and addressing things as you normally would. But That's good. At least you've still been able to connect with your athletes. One thing I know I've talked about with my mentors and everyone, and even my patients, is how important it is to just stay connected during this time and truly connected, not just scrolling through Instagram connected, which I'm sure you can touch way more on than I can. But so let's jump into the meat of our podcast then. Can you tell us a little bit about your why of getting into psychology and specifically sports psychology?
Yeah, so I initially decided psychology was for me because my family's crazy and I thought it was really interesting. And kind of meandered my way through some different ideas. I'm actually listening to the podcast DC about the DC sniper, and it's renewing my interest in being a criminal profiler, but that was the kind of initial idea. I just really find how people think and behave and act and how they're influenced by the world to be really, really fascinating. And shortly into college, decided sports psychology was going to be my jam. I was a college athlete who could have used a sports psychologist for sure. But they weren't really much of a thing then, at least not commonly. So those things combined led me to figuring out how to wind my way through the world and end up doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a good comment on when you were an athlete, could have, being able to use a sports psychologist. I think in the last few years, sports psychology, at least in other disciplines, has started to be something that people are more aware of. And I wish we would have, maybe learned about it even earlier than that when we were going into school, because it is such a valuable thing for our athletes and obviously for everyone. But, if you're not ready to perform mentally, you're not going to perform physically as well. So kind of going off of that, tell us even further about your journey, a little bit about your background and education for our listeners, but then how you got to Ohio State.
Yeah, my undergrad degrees were in psychology and then health and sports studies. So kind of the merging of those. The path I chose then was to go right into a PsyD, psychology and clinical psychology. It didn't have a specific sport focus intentionally, but I kind of self-specialized. I concurrently did an online master's in sports psychology so that I'd have that stuff. And then, it was... psychology has become way more visible and the jobs have been booming in the last 3 to 5 years. But even right when I got out, the jobs weren't there. And I've always known I wanted to work in college athletics. So there were some opportunities in other areas, but for me, college athletics was going to be my space. It's an age group that I just adore. They're fun, they're malleable, they're figuring things out, their brains are growing in. And so, what I did was kind of, and right after grad school, I was starting to get tied down. So I had a partner that I intended to be with for a long time. So geographically, that was going to provide some limitations because he also needs to be employed. And he works in sports marketing and PR. So not a job that can be just anywhere. And so figured that I would kind of collect jobs that would both provide me good skills that maybe other folks wouldn't have in terms of allied and related professions. And I meandered my way through some private practice, college counseling, integrated behavioral health care within a primary care office to get that really medical model, that integration with medical professionals, and, landed kind of the dream gig at Indiana about 3.5 years ago. And had a phenomenal time there. And then about 6 months ago, jumped ship to Ohio State because I'm at a point now where I can choose to balance life and work. I've made it to that platform in my career, and the lifestyle that I was going to be able to have in Columbus was more kind of geared toward what we wanted. So
that dream job, starting in Indiana, which was at that time a dream job, and then now
and it made sense on a lot of fronts. Yeah, so, I think that I had the opportunity to develop programs. So one of the first counseling center that I worked in post-grad wasn't a counseling center before I got there. So it was, I was hired to build from the ground up. So I got good experience of program development within higher ed, which I think gave me an experience that some of my peers may not have had, in terms of really having to navigate that landscape and build something that works. And then I think that the primary care piece as well, that, it really gave me deeper knowledge on things like medication referrals or kind of medical lingo, how to talk to physicians, how to talk to other medical professionals and reduce my psychobabble and take away some of that psych speak, right? And kind of be able to get on that medical level that I think that, we spend so much time investing in and learning that language that it becomes second nature. And when I give presentations, I have to be very careful not to just do psychologist speak. And so, I think that working in that medical setting really gave me that ability. I was in the physician's office and I was being pulled in mid-exam to chat with someone and then reporting back and, talking about the true interfaces between medical diagnoses that I learned so much more about that I might not have unless a family member had that. And so, I think that those were two of the biggest pieces that I felt made my experience unique in a way that was really beneficial for me, that made me good candidates for jobs that I've applied for.
There's some similarities in kind of what you had just touched on with rehab as well, or individuals wanting to get in the sports field, period. I tell my students a lot that I think it's important to understand the medical components of rehab that's just, not sports related. And then also being able to, kind of talk like what you talked about, take away some of your jargon, understand things with your doctors, which you're talking to all of the time. There's a lot of similarities and, being able to be a really good generalist before you hone in on a niche or a craft. So I think that's a really good thing to just kind of bring up for our listeners, that this translates across the board.
It also is really important right now that knowing too, if I get fired tomorrow, I know of a practice in town that I could start working at tomorrow. Like they would take me on because I have experience. I've worked with them before, and I have a generalist background where I don't have to stay in sports because that's my experience. That I can do marriage counseling and I can, work with older adults, and not that my peers couldn't, but may not feel comfortable jumping right into that because it's not something that they've spent some time doing. And so, I think that also just provides me comfort, yet whether or not it's a sellable asset, which, I like to think that it is, but it's also my personal comfort, in these uncertain times, that I know that I am employable in other areas, or should my husband's job take us somewhere, should he get his dream job, that something where I could say, yeah, let's pursue that for a little while. And I have other options, and I can get back to where I need to be. So, I think it just provides a lot of flexibility in addition to, the help in my actual job.
Yeah. Similar to what Jackie said, I really appreciate you touching on that. And I'm sure listeners do too, because at the end of the day, as amazing it is to work with athletes, it is a specialized niche. And I'm sure you've had this experience. We're actually going to jump into this question next, but one of the advice my mentors gave me was go out and be a generalist for 3 to 5 years. Then you really get to see certain diagnoses and you really get to learn how to communicate with doctors. And similar to you, I think you called it psychobabble, which I think is hilarious.
That's amazing.
But it's true. We sometimes just get so medically minded. We're not trying to communicate with the person in front of us. So anyway, that being said, touching back too on some of the themes of taking self-initiative, doing outside of what was expected of you originally, on top of gaining more experience and a deeper knowledge in your profession. So I think that's great advice and some tidbits I hope some listeners really take to heart. So throughout your journey, obviously you've probably had some mentors that pop into your head or that you can think about. Who were some of your mentors along the way? And if you could touch on maybe a piece of advice you thought was very valuable from them.
It's funny when I think of that question. And then when I think of like what you guys are doing, and this isn't an advertisement for you guys, but I think that like, I've never had a mentor that was a sports psychologist.
Wow.
My mentors have always been in outside or allied fields. And I'm not sure if that was intentional. I guess that's not true. I guess my first mentor, but I don't know that at the time he was really a mentor. I think more the relationship with him, like, encouraged me to keep pursuing what I was pursuing. Not necessarily because we talked regularly. He was more of someone I looked up to. He was the first sports psychologist I knew. And he taught like a weekend class in my grad program. And so it was less of maybe him helping or telling me anything that changed things for me, but more just like seeing that he existed as a human was something that helped motivate me that like, okay, this person exists. He's doing this, albeit at a small place and not as his only role. Like that kind of fueled me. But other than that, my mentors really have been other people. So, one of my mentors was a physician. She was the person that I nannied for. I was a live-in nanny at her home, and she was a geriatric primary care doctor and who began specializing in hospice care. And I became really fascinated with a lot of the aspects of medicine and taking care of people in really vulnerable times. And so like learned a lot about that work. She actually got me one of my kind of externships doing geriatric primary care during grad school. And, she kind of taught me a lot about like good practical medicine while being incredibly compassionate. Which to me is a really important thing with student athletes who, I'm very obviously pro college athletics. It's where I want to spend my time, but I do think there's an era of exploitativeness that can occur. And I think even if it's not the true underlying root, I think some of our kids feel that way, that being asked to do things in exchange for stuff. And so I do think they're really vulnerable sometimes. And so being able to show true compassion in people in really vulnerable times was a huge thing for me. And I think I've probably always been a compassionate person. I mean, there's some of that's nature for me, but in terms of medicine, in terms of in what we do. And so I think that was modeled really well for me. And then my mentor now, who's been my mentor for, I don't know, for the last maybe 6 years or so. She's an English professor and never had kids. And we joke that like, I don't know how I'm not her daughter because, she has said more things than I can even quote, but it's all been within the theme of feeling empowered and speaking up, but doing so strategically. So I can get really excited and feel really empowered and get myself into some trouble. And in a job once, I kind of yelled at my boss and I called her right after. And she was like, Chelsi, you need to call your boss back. Like what you said was absolutely correct and true and all of that. And I'm glad that you felt like you could say it, but now you need to backpedal a little bit. But I mean, in every facet of life has been such an encourager and so that to me, as particularly as a female in a still relatively male dominated field, or at least, maybe not always by numbers, but by power, dominated, has really helped me kind of recognize, and I guess maybe what she said to me recently, and I don't verbatim, I'm going to butcher it, but basically that, that, life is going to take me where it's going to take me. And I can really try to make great plans, and I can try to predict everything, and I can try to have it all be calculated out, but I have to kind of let go and let life take me where it's going to take me a little bit. And that was in the time when I was kind of really struggling with the decision of whether to leave IU or not. It took me weeks, and it was a really hard decision for me. And, she kind of said, yeah, because you didn't think you were going to leave, and you've got to let life take you. And so, I think it's been useful for me that none of my mentors have really been in sports psychology, because it's expanded well beyond what I do in the therapy room. That's what I call consulting. I consult with peers. I consult with people in my field. I think true mentorship comes from people who aren't in the trenches in the same space, who can provide such a greater expanded view that helps develop me as a holistic person, which again improves my work. Mm-hmm. Those really great mentorship experiences have grown me as a person.
I think that's such a great definition you brought up for mentorship. Just to touch on that first. I think when you really sit down and look at who your mentors have been through your life, whether you've been in the field for 20 years or whether you've been in the field for one, again, you start to see consultants. I love that you called it that. I'm gonna steal that from you if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Individuals who are next to you in the trenches who maybe have a similar mindset as you, versus mentors are people who are not just helping you in your career, but throughout your life. They're just helping you as a person and assisting you in your growth. I think that's great. If anyone wants to learn more about that, they should read Malcolm Gladwell's book. He talks about how individuals who are your acquaintances tend to have more influence on you because they don't 100%. Have the same mindset as you.
Yes.
And I think you touched on that immensely, which is great. The other thing I think you touched on is both of these mentors really helped with your communication. And it's not that you were communicating, you had the wrong idea, but they helped you get your point across in an effective and strategic way, which speaks volumes as you get more into professional sports. And that's just my bias of what I've seen. But yeah, Jackie, did you have a comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think that was a really insightful view into the mentor that a lot of young individuals don't always think about is, looking across your spectrum of who's in your life or who you're meeting as potential mentors. Anyone can be a potential mentor. So I think that was a really very insightful view into what that is. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe let's dive even deeper into your current role for individuals who don't really know what you may do day to day, for maybe some athletic trainers out there, physical therapists as well. Sometimes I tend to be just as ignorant. How many teams are you managing right now at Ohio State?
So we have 36 teams and there's 4 of us. We don't necessarily have them divvied up evenly or even formally. We kind of have them split up where there's 2 of us over kind of at air quotes over like one set of facilities and 2 of us over the other facilities. But like in practice, that doesn't work. It really is relationship building, and we all work with all the teams in a variety of ways. Mm-hmm. And so, I see student athletes from all the sports. I think that what we know is, particularly in psychology, is what I do in the therapy room is less important than the relationship I have with the person. The biggest predictor of successful outcomes in terms of counseling and psychotherapy is the therapeutic alliance, so the relationship between the counselor and the counselee. And so, for us, that we're always working to make sure that that's a right fit, regardless of who works with which teams or not. And we have 4 very different personalities, which is really helpful. So, we've got someone for everyone in theory.
That's awesome. And then you also work you created a team for marathoners, correct? In Ohio. Can you tell us a little bit about creating that and what that might be?
Yeah. So psyching team's the coolest thing in the world.
I love it. It sounds like it. I'm excied to hear about it.
Cool. Yeah. So the earliest one was way long ago in New York City, and it was there, and then it wasn't, and so from that spawned the Toronto Marathon Psyching Team, and Kate Hayes has been doing that for 20 something years, and at various stages in my life have taken a liking to running and then meandered back away. Now I'm good for a 5K and that's about it. But I've always really admired the running community in general. And I was sitting in my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, a gazillion years ago. Then I was home between patients because the practice I was at was a mile from my house. Then I had a break. I was home on my couch and I'm watching the Boston Marathon coverage. And all of a sudden you see bombings happening. And I was like, holy crap, like this is insane. And I remember thinking I feel like I need to do something, which is problematic in my life because anything I see something like that, I'm like, what can I do? I made my 210th cloth mask yesterday.
Oh, wow. That's amazing though.
Yeah. I've got 20 more to make, so I'm a doer. So I was like, what can I do? How can I support this community? And so I emailed Kate Hayes, who did the Toronto one, and was like, hey, I have emailed with you before about being interested in doing something where I live. Tell me more. Can we get on a call or something? She emailed me back and she said, and Kate Hayes is one of the goats in the field. She is incredible. And she emailed me back, said, hey, I just map quested and it's only 8 hours or 7 hours or something to my house in Toronto. Oh. The Toronto Marathon's in a week and a half. So just come up, you can stay at my house and just do our psyching team and learn about it in person. And I was like, and I called, he was my boyfriend at the time.
Casual.
Right. I go, I have to go. Kay Hayes just invited me to stay at her house. What? I have to go.
Yeah.
I drove up and did it and was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And I was in Columbus, Ohio at the time. I was here for about 18 months, 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. I get everything together and I print out news articles from Toronto, and I print out the handouts that they use, and I send an email to the general email box for the Columbus Marathon. I was like, I don't know who I need to talk to, if this will get to the director, but this is an idea that I want to do, and da-da-da-da. And I get an email back the next day, and it's Darius, the director, and he goes, hey, this sounds cool. Let's meet for coffee. I was like, okay. And so I roll up to this awesome little French bakery, Le Chatelaine in Dublin, Ohio, armed with all my materials. And I sit down and he goes, this is great. What do we need to do to start it? And I was like, no, I was going to pitch you on this. He's like, no, I'm in. What do we do? And it's because of him that we are one of the longer standing, most successful and supported, for sure, way second or third or to Toronto. But from there, I said, okay, I guess we're going to do this. And it must have been maybe June at this point, and our race was in October. And so it was our biggest group that year. I think the momentum of everything with Boston. Mm-hmm. Everyone, but yeah, we now are going to be, I think this October will be assuming the world returns to some normalcy, but I think this will be our 8th year doing it. And so what it is, it's a group of sports psychology and mental health professionals who come together at the race. We have a booth at the expo and we provide free, brief mental skills intervention to our registrants. So tips on reducing nerves, on appropriate goal setting, on strategies for staying calm, for not freaking out, for not, going out the gate, not hitting the wall, or what to do when you do hit the wall. These brief interventions. And it's the most amazing thing. People cry at our booth every year. We give out these little pieces of finish line ribbon. People come back year after year to show us their ribbon from the previous year. They drag their friends over. It's a really incredible experience. I always leave with almost no voice because I volunteer for the full 2 days because I love it so much. And no voice and determined that I'm going to run. I wake up the next day and I'm like, but it's just really inspiring, and it's a small way that we get to impact recreational athletes who don't necessarily have access to our services generally.
That story is so much fun, and I think there's some learning points in there too. One, in taking opportunities when it's given to you, right? Someone who you clearly looked up to in the field, who has started something you want to do, says, hey, you should just come up here. It's 8 hours, but do it, right? Like, that's an opportunity that how can you pass that up? And I think people have to be willing to take those chances. And then almost going back to what you said earlier, life takes you where it takes you, and you have to run with it. And in that moment, life was giving you this opportunity, right, to create something that you were passionate about. And then, look where it's taken you now, which is really incredible. And, once you're doing something you're passionate about, you're not working at all anymore. You're just doing what you love. You kind of touched on some things that you work on with these runners, working on nerves, working on what do you do when you hit the wall. I think there's a lot of similarities in the runner or the endurance athlete overall and an individual trying to get into the sports medicine field. It's a long run to get where you need to go. So what are maybe some 1 or 2 tips that you might give your runners that might also work for the young clinician trying to get in this field?
I think that simplifying things is really important. So, when you're thinking about 26 miles, it's a really effing long time, and it's a crazy amount of time to be running. But if you think about it at the start as I have to run 26 miles, that's really overwhelming. But if you can break it down into little chunks and have a purpose and a goal for each chunk of that, I think that is one of my favorite tips. I've had people where they'll use athletic tape. And if they've broken it into 5 chunks, they'll layer those tape and it'll remind them what they're focused on. And when they get to the end of that, they peel the layer off and they've got the next one ready to go in terms of reminding them kind of what that focus and purpose is. I think that's a really great part of my career has been that, if I was solely focused on this end dream job, that would have been really overwhelming. And I probably would have been really discouraged. But being able to purposefully engage in each chunk of that race in a way that helps me for the next one has been really useful. So I think that's a really important piece that, each of those steps, each of those, career stops or educational stops can't just be to focus on that end goal. It has to be really, you have to invest in what is my focus for this chunk, knowing and trusting that's going to get me there. But I really have to stay focused on what this is and invest in that way. Otherwise, I'm going to miss a whole lot and I'm going to end up in a really painful place. I think that's a big one. I think that I trusting your training, is a similar thing of this idea of I'm just so nervous. Am I going to be able to do it? Am I cut out for that? And I talked with them about trust your training. Your long run went great. What makes you think that this race is going to go any different? And I think it's that similar thing of there's that imposter. When you land that first job in sports, man, it is like, people trust me. Like, are you sure? You asked, wait, did you say you asked me a question and like my answer is like the final answer? Like, you don't want to double check that. So I think that there's that piece of each new position. We learn the fundamentals in school, but you learn what you need to know on the job. Like we learn on the job, like whether it's PT and learning on a picture of something or on a dummy or on a fellow student, you actually learn what you need to know when you're in with patients. It's the same way for any of our professions. And so, not having that imposter syndrome, not questioning what we're doing and trusting that the training is there. You are going to encounter things you didn't expect. You are going to encounter things you don't have answers for. And you use the training that you have and the information that you have and you make the best of it. And you're going to screw up. You might run a negative split too early in the race, but that's okay. We can recover from that. We have the training to do so. I think those would be a couple of the crossover themes.
Yeah, those crossover themes, I wanted to bring that up because there are so many things that are in common with just any field, any job, really. Sure. And I think, taking students, I like to tell them the same thing, like focus on the now. right?
Yeah.
There's always, everybody's a go-getter, which is great. Everyone in coming up is wanting to get to this certain level, but I think it's important that you stay true to the moment where you're going to learn the most, and those values and those experiences are going to take with you throughout your whole career.
For sure.
Yeah, and I love that you gave a little bit of an action step in that, and advice too, in case anyone was listening, is, one, yes, having that long-term goal, but in order to enjoy the process, trust the process, enjoy the journey where you are, whatever you want to call it, you're chunking those experiences so that you're getting the most out of it. I think that's
For sure.
amazing, and I think that's great advice, especially in our field. Like you said, if you had just set that one goal of, being a collegiate sports psychologist, you might have gotten a lot of discouraged or very discouraged along the way. So I love that you brought that up. I think that is such practical advice for anyone in the field or anyone in life. So I really appreciate that. So with all these unique opportunities that you've had, and obviously they've been great, you've been all across the spectrum, which I personally love. What, if any, obstacles have you encountered, and how have you overcame them? It could be one or two. It doesn't have to be anything.
So I want to preface it with my general life philosophy and perspective is I'm a very strengths-based person. I am a very cup full, not half full, just very, I've been able to, and if I want to unpack all the psychological aspects behind it, I could, but have always just seen things as things. So one of the things that I always worry about is when I talk about obstacles, I'm not able to come up with a lot of them, but not because I didn't have a lot of them, but my perspective and the way that I think about them, it's hard for me to recall many. And my husband and I talk about it all the time where, we're people that something happens and then we immediately start talking about well, this is great. We like to justify things. So we'll be like, we'll see why this was really great. Da, 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 da. And we downplay the fact that there could be any negativity and which, sometimes can be problematic, but, so I know that there have been, there have been jobs I didn't get that I was really disappointed about, but honestly, when I look back, thank God I didn't. So at the time they may have felt like obstacles, but when I look back now, they definitely weren't, even though they felt that way. So that's, my life has not been necessarily this rosy, everything's been super easy, but definitely my perspective is being able to find meaning and to say yeah, that wasn't actually a barrier. I think my biggest one, the one that always comes up when I think about it at all, is for psychology, for a doctorate, you do 4 years or 5 years of school, and then you have to do an internship. And it's an internship match process where you apply and you interview and then you rank and then you match or you don't. And my cohort, my year was the worst match in the history of psychology match, where there was 25% less internships than people applying for them. And you have to do the internship to graduate.
Holy moly.
And so if you don't get an internship, you don't graduate, which means another year of student loans, which means another year of delaying things. And so it's a really high stress scenario. And I didn't get any interviews. It's not that I didn't match. I didn't get any interviews, so I couldn't even enter match. And it was this earth-shattering, what do I do now? I ended up cold calling places and finding somewhere that was not part of the formal internship process, but would take me and it would count and it would be fine. But I think that was probably my biggest barrier. But I think that probably is when I first really started to invest in this idea of what is a barrier, right? If you think of a hurdler, they're running forward toward barriers all the time, but it doesn't stop them. And so, I think that, that's the one that I always think of, but I also think that's the one that changed my perspective. So when I think about, sure, practically not getting a certain job is a barrier, but it has never been a barrier. I've always found a way to climb over it or under it or drag it with me for a little bit. So I've experienced things. I feel like I've experienced some gender, some ageism. I've not personally can't recall any gender issues in employment and stuff, but I've experienced some ageism. But I've always just felt empowered that like, that's my opportunity to educate people and to be myself and to give them a new experience of working with someone, who's youngish. So I'm sure there's been more, but I still would identify as barriers because they've become just part of my path. But I also think that sounds like really like, oh, like I haven't had any barriers. Like life is, and I always feel like, I don't want to like alienate or have people be like, I have like, well, I have barriers. Does that mean I shouldn't? Like in the moment, things feel shitty. And they can be barriers. I think that I haven't had any in the super recent past. And so it's easier for me to have a rosy picture of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's about perspective, but also you touched on taking your first barrier or taking one of your biggest barriers and turning it into a lesson for yourself and really self-reflecting. I think we all have a similar situation in our careers. For us, we've talked about with some other people, your first denial as a young physical therapist, your first situation that a patient goes, I don't want to see you. You're too young or you're too small or something like that. And I think at the moment we're just kind of like, why didn't I get that buy-in or why didn't I get that job or whatever it may be. But taking that and saying, okay, am I going to take this moment and let it take me into a negative space? Or am I going to say, maybe that patient or maybe that situation wasn't meant for me and they're going to be better with someone else and another opportunity is going to present itself for me and I'm going to take it. So I think there was a really good kind of learning lesson in what you just said as well. Moving into kind of, overcoming, we don't want to call them barriers anymore, but opportunities. Yeah. What would you define as success? Or I guess you could also kind of touch into what do you want your success to mean as far as what your legacy is or what your accomplishments are?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot. I think success, I think overall success for me is feeling balanced. That if we go on small, tiny things of clients that aren't going to want to work with me, but do I have that balance? Are there people who are making really good progress? Okay. When I retire someday, have I positively impacted people? Have I made a difference in places that I've been? But overall, like, do I feel like I have balance in my life? That's why I took this Ohio State job. It's given me that ability to say I have balance in my life. And that to me is success. I say this with a lot of privilege. I'm not motivated by money at all. It's because I make a very good salary, but for me, financial success was never a part of the picture. I want to make enough money to pay my bills and to go on a vacation. But I'm not motivated by more of that. That's success to me isn't my money in the bank. Success to me is feeling fulfilled, wanting to go to work every day and knowing when I leave that I made a difference in some way in someone's life. I think that I have this like if we get into some weird, if I go just take you on a weird tangent, like I am absolutely like this pacifist, like this democratic socialist. Like I just want everyone to be happy and healthy and balanced and have the things they need. And like, I want to contribute to that. And I want everyone to get along. Even amidst conflict, like have conflict, but like, let's all just care about each other as humans. And so, my perspective on success is very aligned with that. Like, I want to feel like I've provided a space for that in my home, whether it's people coming to visit in my home, whether it's the people that live in my home, in my job, whether it's the kids I'm working with, whether it's people I work with, directly or indirectly, that to me is going to be a much more successful legacy than I held these titles, or I made this much money, or I bought these tangible things. And that's not everyone's view of success. And I, totally respect that. I have plenty of friends who success for them is, they paid a lot for their education and they want a title and they want to make this much money so they can do these things. And that's awesome. But for me, it's so much more like, warm and fuzzy and fluffy.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up both of those perspectives, because there's nothing wrong with either of those.
Right.
I love that your legacy is making an impact on someone, but it's also having balance in your life.
Yeah.
I think that's something we don't get mentored, quote unquote, if we want to put that in there, mentored on enough as an individual in the sports med field, because again, at the end of the day, it is a grind. It's a grind we all love.
Yes.
And that we thrive in, to be honest, but there are other aspects to it. So I appreciate your definition of success, because like you said, it's different for everyone.
Yep. It's mine. It doesn't have to be anyone else's. And, but it's always fun to hear other people's, how they identify that.
Yeah.
Well, in a final question and wrap up, I think another thing that would be really valuable to listeners, or, at least selfishly me, I know for my athletes, I want to incorporate this interdisciplinary model, but don't always know where to go to find someone like you. So are there any resources out there that individuals like me or strength and conditioning coaches or coaches themselves could go to find someone to seek your services?
Yeah, on a really super basic level, ask the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. I think it's like appliedsportspsych.org or something, but if you Google it, you'll find it. They have a database for their CMPC, certified mental performance coaches. Those folks are not necessarily always going to be mental health folks, but they're the performance side. And some of them are dual mental health and performance, but they have a database. So you can always plug in, your zip code and see who's nearby. And they're in that database to be contacted and utilized. There's the APA Division 47 group, so psychologists who are trained in sports psychology. Those are kind of the quick and dirty. You can always hop on the Google machine. All of us are happy to be contacted. Obviously, everyone has different demands and requirements on their time, different fee structures and all that stuff. But for the most part, in any major city, you're going to find a handful of us. But most of us are also willing to do some consulting in from a distance. And even if we aren't able to take on referrals, we are always, I'm speaking for everybody and I shouldn't. I am always, and many people I know are always just to provide some quick consultation and tips. If it's, hey, I've noticed a lot of this in my patients, and what are some quick things I can do? I'm on a contract that doesn't allow me to have a vibrant private practice, which is fine. So, I'm not necessarily taking outside patients, but, I have had people contact me and just say, hey, I'm noticing this a lot. Do you have any websites, links, tips, videos? And I'm happy to resource people. And so, it's, there may be people locally, or you may be in a dead zone where there aren't any of us. And, but we can always help direct to additional resources. And there are plenty of folks on the different websites that can help identify who might be willing to or able to help out.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I hope everybody who is not knowing about sports psychology learned a little bit about what you do, but also goes and looks at some of those resources that you just mentioned and starts incorporating that into their practice, because it's such a valuable component for the human and the patient experience. But Chelsi, thank you so much for being on our podcast today. We appreciate it. I learned a lot, and Lindsay learned a lot. And we look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Women Leaders in Sports Medicine podcast. This podcast is for you to take a step closer to your dreams. Visit www.womenleadersinsportsmedicine.com to join our roundtables, learn about our mentorship programs, and to let us know what you want to hear. Have a great day, and remember, it's your time to lead.